This gaming PC looks sleek and it's pretty compact, and the awesome part, it only cost me $578. Now yes, it isn't the most common pairing of PC parts, especially in 2024, but this computer will crush just about any game at 1080p with high settings, and it's even capable of gaming at 1440p. I'm not gonna stand here and tell you that you're gonna build it for the same price I did. I honestly got some pretty good deals on the CPU and graphics card, but that just goes to show you you can build it for a cheaper price. If you don't take the time to find good deals, you will spend around $665, but for that $665, you're getting a compact gaming PC that can play any game right now. And say you really enjoy this hobby, you can upgrade this to unlock even more power, all while keeping the same motherboard and RAM kit. Now the main part of this build is the case. This video is actually sponsored by Deepcool and their new CH160 ITX case. You've probably seen everyone and their mom already building in this thing on YouTube, but there's a good reason for that. This case only costs $70, and for that price you're getting a high airflow ITX case, comes in white and black, has a handle which some people may like. If you don't like it, then it is removable, but it's super cool if you want to take it over to your buddy's house and just play some games. It's definitely a LAN party worthy case. One thing I want to add about the case, you can see it has these hole punches all throughout, and well, Deepcool sells these Pixel series little decorative bits. You can basically make any design you want in the case, which is pretty cool. As I said, it's not the smallest ITX chassis, it's around 15 liters in total volume, but since it is on the larger side, you do have more hardware support. For power supplies, normally in an ITX case, you're limited to using an SFX power supply, and those can get expensive, but this case also supports ATX power supplies up to 140 millimeters in length, so just make sure yours is compatible. Unfortunately though, there is no AIO support in this case, but you can use some beefy air coolers. You have up to 172 millimeters in height for CPU coolers, and you can also mount 2 fans at the top or 1 in the rear, but it really depends on what CPU cooler you go for. Now for graphics card support, you can fit some thick black things in here, and even if your GPU is white, it'll fit as well. You have support for 3-slot GPUs up to 305 millimeters in length if you use an SFX power supply, and then up to 230 millimeters in length if you opt for an ATX power supply. As I said, no AIO support, so I'm using this cooler Deepcool sent out. It is their Assassin 4S. It also comes in black and white, so you can match the case. The cooler is 164 millimeters in height, so we have about 10 millimeters to spare. Thank you Deepcool for being the sponsor for this video. Be sure to check out their new CH160 and their Assassin 4S CPU cooler with a link down below. Without further ado, let's go over all the rest of the parts in this build, and we'll take a look at some gaming benchmarks. Starting off with the CPU, motherboard, RAM, and storage choices. The CPU I went with is the Ryzen 5 3600. I scored this on eBay for $57.99. Now I actually secured it in a combo deal with the Noctua NH-U9S CPU cooler. I valued the cooler at $7.99, and that makes my cost for the CPU $50. On average, they sell for $70 used, so if I were you, I wouldn't spend more than that, and if you happen to find it for close to $50, then that's your sign it's a good deal. I'm pairing the CPU with this MSI B450 ITX motherboard. It's a Gaming Plus AC. I've had this thing sitting in my inventory for at least 2 years, so I just hope it works. I got it for $50, and ITX motherboards are more expensive, but you can find one for around $80 used, or if you buy new, Gigabyte has an A520 board for $120 on Amazon. Now for RAM, you don't want to go any slower than 3200 megahertz, but if you have a little extra money or find a good deal on a 3600 megahertz kit, then I recommend you get that. I'm using this T-Force Vulcan Z 2x8 gigabyte kit clocked at 3200 megahertz. I bought this on eBay for $26.80. Now if you go the new route, you can expect to pay $30 to $40. And now for our storage solution, I'm going with the 512 gigabyte M.2 SSD. It's a Gen 3 King spec model. I paid $34.31, which is a pretty standard price. Storage has been increasing recently, so if you're buying new, you can expect to pay at least $60 to $100 depending on the model you get, and I recommend you get at least a 512 gigabyte to 1 terabyte. Now those are the main parts for the computer minus the graphics card. Now if you've never built a PC before, let me show you how to prep the motherboard before we install it inside the case. Simply grab your motherboard. You can either set it on the box or just a flat surface, just not right on top of carpet. Then you grab your CPU, and if you put it right up to your face, you can see it has a little gold triangle in the bottom left corner, and if you look at the motherboard, you can also see it has the same triangle. You'll just want to line those two things up, pull back this little lever here, lower that CPU into the socket, and then with a little bit of force, push down the lever back in its place. For RAM, it's quite similar to the CPU. They have a slit that isn't quite centered, and the RAM slots on the motherboard have the same off-centered slit. Just push out these little tabs right here, then you just line up those two slits and firmly push them into place until you hear it click. If it's not clicking, it's probably in wrong. And now to install the storage. Our motherboard's M.2 slot is around the back, so you just line up the M.2 SSD with the slot, push it into place at a slight angle, and then screw it down. When building a PC, you normally want to install the CPU cooler before the case, but we will do that last so we have room to plug in all the cables. Now it's time we can install the motherboard inside the Deepcool CH160. To start, you'll just want to remove all the side panels. The front and back are secured with 2 screws, and the top is secured with a few screws as well. And then after that, you'll just want to remove these 2 fan brackets at the top. Now from there, it's a pretty straightforward process. Just secure the motherboard down with the 4 included screws. Oh, and don't forget to install the IO shield for an extra 10 FPS. Now we can install the power supply. As you know, you can either go ATX or SFX. I'm opting for an SFX unit, but the one I'm using is overkill and expensive. I just happen to have it on hand. It's a Corsair SF750, which is 80 plus platinum. And when I bought it, I spent $149.67. I recommend you either go with a cheaper SFX unit or an ATX unit, and you can expect to pay right around $60 or even more for a brand new power supply. I'll have options linked down below, and of course you can go used, but that's up to you if you're comfortable with that. Once you get the power supply secured, plugging in the cables is nice and straightforward. I would start with the case cables. You have a USB 3 cable, Type-C, front audio, and your normal front panel connectors. Your USB 3 goes over here on the right side of the board. I'm not plugging in the Type-C because my motherboard doesn't have a Type-C slot, but if yours does, it will look like this, and that's where you'll plug it in. For the front audio, it's at the bottom left corner of the board, right above the PCIe slot. And finally, for the front panel connector, Deepcool made it super easy, and they combined all of the little plugs into one single plug, and that just goes right here above the front panel audio. And now for the power supply cables. Your 8-pin CPU power goes up here at the top left corner, and your 24-pin motherboard power cable plugs in right here where the big black section is. The last cable to plug in right now is actually for the power supply, and don't forget to switch it on. Before we install the cooler, I'm actually going to install the graphics card first, and I'm going with an option that's around $180 on the used market. It's from Nvidia, and it's arguably one of the best graphics cards they've ever made. The GPU I'm talking about is none other than the GTX 1080 Ti. I actually happen to have the Founders Edition. Quick RIP EVGA GPUs in the comments. I scored this bad boy for only $100 on my local market. Now the original plan was to flip it, but I've always wanted the 1080 Ti, more specifically the SC Black Edition from EVGA, but I decided to hold on to this one because of the great price, and now I'm finally using it. Okay, now we can mount the CPU cooler. It's a pretty simple process. First, start removing the stock mounting hardware. Then grab this bag with these 4 little screws and these 2 brackets. Screw the 4 screws down with the black part facing the motherboard. Then you mount the brackets with the arrows pointing towards the CPU, and you secure those mounting brackets with these 4 screws here. Then apply thermal paste, and Deepcool provides their own with this cooler. And don't forget to remove this protective film. Finally, lower the cooler into place. Remove this little top piece covering the fan. Just lift the fan out of the way, and then using the provided screwdriver, secure that thing into place. Now, one of the last but very optional parts that I'm deciding to add are these green cable extensions. The reason being is because the GeForce GTX logo on the GPU is green. I thought it would be cool to try to find matching cables, and these are almost perfect. Like I said, these are optional, and they are kind of annoying to work with in this smaller case, but after getting them installed, they don't look too bad. Alrighty, getting ready for the first boot. Let's go. Let's go, baby. And with that, the build is finished. I think it turned out pretty clean, at least in my opinion, and I'm happy that I was able to use the green cable extensions. It really added a nice extra pop of color to the build. And before we get into the benchmarks, I want to make a quick disclaimer. This computer will cost you right around $550 to upwards of $660. If you want to save more money, you can swap around some parts, go for a cheaper case, a cheaper cooler, but if you want to build what I did, then I'll have all the parts linked down below for you to check them out, and they are affiliate links, so they do help out the channel. Now that we have that out of the way, let's play some games. First things I did before any testing was update the BIOS because it was a few years outdated, and I made sure the XMP profile was enabled on our RAM so we could get the best performance possible. Then I ran Cinebench stress tests for both the CPU and GPU just to see what the temperatures are like. For the CPU, we saw a max temp of 69°C, and for our graphics card, it had a max temperature of 76°C. Now for gaming benchmarks. I tested Fortnite first at 1440p with DirectX 12, and I set it to the high settings preset with anti-aliasing set to TAA. Now the game looked good, but we only averaged 40 FPS. Honestly, if you're playing Fortnite, you want at least a 60 FPS average, and I doubt you're going to be playing at those settings, so I instantly switched the resolution to 1080p. I kept it with the same high settings, and we scored an average of 58 with a terrible 1% low of 3. The 1% low was around 30, but it had a pretty bad stutter which messed it up and dropped it down to 3. Now yes, it did sort of play better at 1080p, but what if you wanted even more performance so you can be a sweat and box kids up? Well, I changed it from DirectX 12 to performance mode, and at 1440p we averaged 201 FPS, and then if you play at 1080p with performance mode, you will average 243 FPS. For another game that isn't too demanding, I tested Warzone Resurgence, first at 1440p with the recommended preset, and after looking at the settings it applied, it's basically like all high settings with a lower render resolution, so keep that in mind while you watch the gameplay. I was actually doing pretty good for my first game on. Your boy managed to get a few kills, but then I got outgunned by this guy, but the system did great. We averaged 80 FPS with a 1% low of 56. Now if you drop down to 1080p with the same recommended preset, you see a slight increase in performance. We averaged 85 FPS and had a 1% low of 50. This computer is perfect for high refresh rate gaming, and you could tweak the settings and achieve closer to that 144 FPS. The last esports title was Apex Legends. I tested both 1440p and 1080p at high settings and had anti-aliasing set to TSAA. Now recently I've been playing Warzone more than Apex, so I'm a bit rusty, but somehow I found someone worse than me. They also have this solos mode for a limited time right now, and it's pretty cool. At 1440p we averaged 127 FPS with a 1% low of 79, and at 1080p we scored an average FPS of 147. So those are all the esports titles I tested. Now before we get into harder to run games, I want to mention that this will run other esports games. Just because I didn't test them doesn't mean they don't work. With a little bit of research, I found you can play Valorant at 1080p with high settings and average 194 FPS with a 1% low of 111. And games like Rainbow Six Siege, CSGO, and Minecraft will all work perfectly. Now for my harder to run games, some AAA titles. I started with Forza Horizon 5. I kept it simple and I utilized the built-in benchmarking tool, and at 1440p with the ultra settings, we averaged 66 FPS and the game looked amazing. It had a 1% low of 53 and it was super smooth. Now dropping down to 1080p with high settings, the game still looked nice and crispy and we averaged 74 FPS. Hopping into Hogwarts Legacy, I was just running around with the ultra settings preset and I was quite surprised. At 1440p, it looked great. It wasn't above 60 FPS, but it was smooth with an average of 44 and 1% low of 28. Now for some reason, when I was trying to test it in 1080p, the only way for it to be 1080p was to be in window mode, which I didn't like. So I passed it up and instead I dropped the settings to medium at 1440p, and that gave us a nice 68 FPS average with a 1% low of 36. For the final game, I tested good old Cyberpunk 2077. I remember when this game first came out, it was so unoptimized. It's definitely came a long way. I ran the in-game benchmark with the ultra settings preset, but I turned off resolution scaling because it always enables it, and I just wanted to see raw performance. Now with those settings, we saw a low average, but it was pretty smooth and the visuals looked great. Now if you drop down from ultra settings to 1440p with medium settings, you will see an average FPS of 50 with a 1% low of 39. Still isn't above that 60 FPS mark, so I turned back on the resolution scaling, and then we saw above that 60. We scored an average of 82 and a 1% low of 55, and despite enabling resolution scaling, it still looked pretty sharp. Now finally dropping the resolution to 1080p, this game wasn't too hard at all. I retested it with the medium preset and had no resolution scaling enabled, and even then we saw an average FPS of 78. And like I said with esports titles, this computer will handle many other games as well. I was trying to find performance for games like Starfield with these exact parts, but I couldn't find the exact part. But I did find kind of similar performance, and I guarantee you can get close to 60 FPS, if not above it, in both 1080p and 1440p, depending on the settings that you use. Anyways, I'm pretty happy with this build. I had a ton of fun building it, ton of fun playing on it, and I really love how this green turned out. I just want to give another thank you to Deepcool for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check out their new CH160 case down below. It's available in black and in white. If you made it to the end of the video, go ahead and smash that like button if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you loved it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.